The night shift at St. Marguerite's had a smell that never left you, antiseptic and old coffee, and something underneath both of those things that you eventually stopped trying to name. Layla Osei had been breathing it in for 3 years. She was 26, which felt simultaneously too young and too old for the particular exhaustion that had settled into her shoulders around month 8 and never fully lifted. Her mother called it the nurse stoop. Her brother called it the look. Layla called it Tuesday. She was pulling a double because Hendricks had called in sick again, and because Dr. Faulkner, the unit director, had looked at her with that particular expression. The one that said, "You're the reliable one. You're the one who won't say no." And Layla had done what she always did, which was say yes. She was 26. She had $43,000 in nursing school debt, a cracked phone screen she kept meaning to replace, and a sublet in the plateau that her landlord had just told her would be going up $200 in February. She had a box of her father's things in her closet that she hadn't opened since the funeral, and a voicemail from the hospital's billing department about his outstanding balance, $12,000 for his last 11 days, that she had listened to 4 times without calling back. She had not slept more than 5 hours in a stretch since October. It was now mid-January, and the snow outside the long windows of the 4th-floor corridor was the kind that came in sideways, horizontal and mean. Montréal in winter had a particular brutality that tourists never quite believed until they experienced it. Layla had grown up here. She knew it intimately. She still hated it. She was doing her last medication round at 11:40 p.m., pushing the cart past room 412, when she heard the sound. Not an alarm, not a call button, just a voice, low, controlled, and unmistakably, someone trying not to sound like they were in pain. She stopped. Layla had good ears for suffering. 3 years of night shifts will do that. She could distinguish between the cry of someone who was scared and the cry of someone who was actually deteriorating. She could tell the difference between a moan that needed documentation and one that needed immediate action. It was not a skill she'd been taught. It was something the job had carved into her. She knocked once on the door of 412, then pushed it open without waiting. The man in the bed was sitting up, which he was not supposed to be. She knew he wasn't supposed to be because she'd read his chart 40 minutes ago. Tobias Cray, 51, admitted 2 days ago under the care of Dr. Leclerc for cardiac monitoring following a procedure. Bed rest recommended, no exertion. But the man wasn't the one who stopped her. The man in the chair beside the bed was. He was standing by the time she fully entered the room, which shouldn't have been possible. She'd barely made a sound. But he was on his feet, positioned slightly in front of the chair between her and the patient. It was a gesture so practiced it had become instinct. She recognized that kind of body language. She'd seen it in security details at the private wing downtown, in the one bodyguard who'd accompanied a certain city councillor's wife after an incident 2 years ago. She'd never seen it quite like this. He was tall in the way that made the room feel smaller. Dark hair, slightly too long. A jaw that looked like someone had drawn it with intent. He was wearing a suit jacket that probably cost more than her monthly rent, but the collar of his shirt was open, and there was a stillness to him that had nothing to do with patience and everything to do with control. He was watching her the way people watch exits. "I knocked," Layla said, because it was the first thing that came out of her mouth, and also because she'd learned that in situations where she wasn't sure what she was walking into, it helped to establish the simple facts. "You did," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Slight accent she couldn't immediately place. Not Quebecois, not quite European. Something in between. "Mr. Cray isn't supposed to be sitting up," she said, looking past the man to the patient. "Sir, I need you to lie back, please." Tobias Cray, who looked considerably less alarmed than the situation seemed to warrant, gave a small, apologetic shrug. "I told him you'd notice." "He told me you'd notice," the man confirmed, which was not an apology, but was perhaps the closest he was going to get to one. Layla walked to the bed. She kept her eyes on her patient, checked his monitors, noted his color, asked him about his chest. He was fine. Tired and stubborn and fine. She adjusted his position, noted the time, wrote it down. When she straightened, the man was still watching her. "You can sit," she said. "You don't have to stand like that." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like recalibration, like I'm a threat. She gathered her things. "I'm the nurse on this floor. I'm here to make sure he doesn't have another event. That's all." She left without looking at him again. She thought about him for 6 minutes, she estimated, before the logistics of the night swallowed her back up. She had 2 other patients who needed checking, a new admission at midnight, and a resident who kept paging her about a potassium level that she kept trying to explain was within acceptable range. By 2 a.m., she had forgotten the man in room 412 existed, in the way she forgot most things during a double, not completely, but far enough back in her mind that it didn't interfere with function. At 2:47 a.m., the call button from 412 lit up. She went. Tobias Cray was pale and sweating, and his pressure had dropped, and what followed was 40 minutes of controlled urgency that she moved through without thinking, calling the right people, doing the right things, keeping her voice calm and her hands steady while everything around her moved too fast, and not fast enough at the same time. Afterward, when the resident had been and the situation had been stabilized, and Tobias Cray was sleeping again under closer monitoring, Layla stood in the corridor and pressed her back against the wall and breathed. The man was leaning against the wall across from her. He'd apparently followed the team out and stayed. Security hadn't asked him to move. She wasn't sure anyone had thought to. He looked at her for a long moment. "He's stable," she said. She wasn't sure why she told him. He hadn't asked. "His pressure's back up. Dr. Leclerc will be in at 6. He nodded once. "You were good in there," he said. It was such a simple thing to say. She'd heard variations of it before. Attending physicians sometimes said it. Other nurses said it after complicated nights. But something about the way he said it, like it was a factual observation rather than a courtesy, made it land differently than she expected. "That's the job," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "But not everyone does the job like that." She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. She pushed off the wall and went back to the nursing station, and she didn't look back, and she was approximately 70% sure he was still watching her when she turned the corner. She saw him twice more over the next 2 days. Once in the elevator, where he inclined his head in a way that felt almost formal, and once outside the hospital at the end of her shift, standing by a black vehicle with tinted windows, while he talked on the phone, his free hand in his pocket, his posture the same controlled stillness she'd noticed the first night. He wasn't looking at her. She told herself she didn't notice him, and then spent the 40-minute metro ride home trying to remember if she'd actually seen what she thought she'd seen, whether the slight pause in his conversation when she'd walked past had been real or imagined. She was very tired. Tired people imagined things. On the 4th day, Tobias Cray was transferred to a step-down unit, and Layla stopped thinking about either of them. The call from the collections agency came on a Wednesday afternoon when she was standing in the cereals aisle of the Provigo on Rachel Street with $11 and some change in her account, and her phone balanced between her shoulder and ear because the wire on her earbuds had finally given out. She let them say what they were going to say. She said she would look into it. She hung up and stood there for a moment looking at the boxes of cereal and thinking about the number they had quoted her, which was not the 12,000 she'd heard in the first voicemail. The number had grown. There were fees now, processing fees, administrative fees, fees she was certain her father, who had spent his working life as a high school music teacher and had died 2 months after retirement, would have found both baffling and genuinely funny in a dark sort of way. She bought the store-brand oatmeal and went home. The thing about debt that no one told you, or maybe they told you and you didn't really absorb it until it was yours, was that it wasn't just the money. It was the weight of it, the way it was always there, somewhere under everything else, a low-grade pressure that never fully disappeared. She'd been managing it, mostly. Her nursing salary wasn't extravagant, but it was steady, and she was careful, and she'd been chipping away at the original student loan on a schedule she'd mapped out in a spreadsheet that her friend Joelle called aggressively adult, with a mix of admiration and concern. But her father's debt was different. Her father's debt felt like something had reached into the spreadsheet and deleted a column she hadn't known was there. She ate her oatmeal standing up at the kitchen counter and looked out the window at the snow and thought about her options, which were get a second job, take on more doubles, talk to a debt advisor, or go to sleep. She went to sleep. She was back on the floor 3 days later when she rounded the corner of the corridor and nearly walked into him. He caught her, one hand on her elbow, quick and precise, and she had a split second of complete unreasonable composure before her brain caught up with what was happening. Mr. Cray was moved, she said, her first thought apparently still about her job. I know. He let go of her elbow immediately. I'm here for something else. Visiting someone. In a manner of speaking. He paused. I wanted to see you. Layla looked at him. She was not a person who was easily rattled. She'd had difficult patients and difficult families, and one particularly difficult situation involving a visiting dignity from somewhere in the Gulf who had not understood what no visitors after 9 meant. She had good boundaries. She had been told she had a very calming presence, which she had always privately suspected was just another way of saying she was good at suppressing visible anxiety. She was experiencing some visible anxiety. Why, she said. Because I wanted to ask you something. He glanced at the corridor, which was empty, but not in a reassuring way. Is there somewhere less? The family room, she said. End of the hall, 5 minutes. She did not know why she agreed to this. She would think about that later. She finished what she was doing first, because she was a professional, and then she went to the family room and he was already there, standing by the window with his hands in his pockets. You don't sit, she observed. I do, he said, when it makes sense to. She sat because it was her hospital and she was choosing her own posture, and she looked at him expectantly. He pulled something from his jacket pocket and set it on the table between them. It was an envelope. Her name was on the front, typed. She didn't touch it. What is that? She said. $14,000, he said. There's a bank draft inside. It's from an anonymous source. Legally. Properly documented. She looked at the envelope and then at him and felt something very still settle over her. You're going to want to explain that, she said. My associate, the man you treated the other night, is a specific kind of person with specific kinds of connections. And those connections occasionally include access to certain kinds of records. He paused. He asked me to look into whether you were all right. Why would he do that? Because you came into that room at 2:47 in the morning, and you were calm and you were correct, and you probably saved his life, and Tobias Cray is someone who notices things like that. Looking into my finances is not. No, he said, it isn't. He didn't apologize exactly, but there was something in the way he said it. Direct without deflection, that acknowledged the line without pretending it wasn't there. She'd worked with enough physicians who couldn't do that much to find it disarming. I'm not taking money from a stranger, she said. I know. Then why are you here? To give you the choice. He looked at her steadily. You can leave it on the table. You can take it, or you can tell me it was wrong to come, and I'll go, and you won't see either of us again. She looked at the envelope. 14,000 covered the debt. It covered the debt and left something over. She had looked at that number so many times in the last 2 months that she had its digits memorized like a bad song. Who are you? She said. My name is Soren, he said. Most people call me by my last name, which is Vane. She didn't know the name. She looked at his face and tried to read it and found it largely illegible in the way that some faces were. Not blank, but composed, the way a good hand of cards might be held, showing nothing. Soren Vane, she said. Yes, and Mr. Cray, Tobias Cray, he's my business. That's not an answer. No, he agreed, it isn't. She stood up. She left the envelope on the table because she hadn't decided anything yet. And she was not a person who made financial decisions while sitting across from a man who had access to her credit history. and a suit that cost more than she made in a month, and eyes that were doing something extremely inconvenient to her sense of professional detachment. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded once. She walked to the door and then stopped, because there was something she needed to know, and she'd learned over the years that you didn't always get second chances at the direct question. "Did you know," she said, before he went into distress that night, "did you know something was going to happen and not tell me?" The question cost her something to ask. If the answer was yes, she needed to know that about herself. That she was sitting here entertaining envelopes from people who had withheld clinical information. He was quiet for a moment. "I noticed a change in his color around 2:30, he said. "I was reaching for the call button when you came in." It wasn't exactly what she'd asked, but it was honest enough that she knew it was all she was going to get. She left. She Googled the name that night. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. A LinkedIn profile, a company website, the kind of thin digital footprint that most people left by accident. What she found was less. There was one reference in a Montréal Gazette article from 4 years ago, a single mention of a private investment firm associated with a name she didn't recognize, citing Vane Capital in passing. There was a brief notation in what appeared to be a court document summary, heavily redacted. There was nothing else. There was nothing else, and that was a kind of answer. She lay in her dark apartment and thought about the envelope and about her father's debt, and about the way Soren Vane had said, "I noticed a change in his color around 2:30. Like it was information rather than an excuse, like he had processed it without flinching and was now simply reporting it. She thought about the way he'd stood in front of the chair, between her and his associate. She thought about the word associate. She went to sleep. The envelope was still in the family room in the morning, which she hadn't expected. She'd thought someone would have taken it, or that it would have simply ceased to exist in the way of things she'd half imagined. But it was there when she checked, tucked slightly under the edge of a tissue box, and she stood in the doorway for a long moment before she went to start her shift. She told Joelle at lunch. Joelle, who was a palliative care nurse, and therefore had seen things that had permanently recalibrated her emotional scale, listened without interrupting. She had a gift for that, for the contained, quality attention that she gave to dying people, and also, apparently, to Layla's increasingly strange life situations. "He paid your dead dad's debt," Joelle said when she'd finished. "He left the money. I haven't taken it. But he left it. He left it on the table and told me it was my choice." Joelle ate a forkful of quinoa salad and looked at the middle distance the way she did when she was thinking about something that had no tidy resolution. "The fact that he left it," she said finally. "That he told you it was your choice and then left. Yes, most men who want something make sure you don't have the option of leaving it behind." Layla thought about that. "I don't know what he wants," she said. "You know what he doesn't want," Joelle said. "He doesn't want you to feel like you owe him." She sat with that for the rest of her shift. She took the envelope. She did it on a Thursday afternoon, on her way out of a 10-hour day, because she had stood in that family room long enough, and her father was dead and the debt was not, and some's decisions, she'd learned, did not get better for additional deliberation. She was in the lobby when she saw him. He was not alone. A man she didn't recognize stood a short distance behind him, in the particular kind of casual stance that wasn't casual at all. But Soren Vane was looking at his phone and hadn't noticed her yet, and for one clear second she had the choice to walk past him. She didn't. "I took it," she said. He looked up. No visible surprise. She was starting to think visible surprise might not be a thing he experienced. "All right," he said. "I need you to explain to me who Tobias Cray is," she said. "Not details. I'm not asking for details. But I need to know if treating him, if having access to his chart, if that put anyone in this hospital at risk." It was the question she should have asked first. She knew that. She was asking it now because she should have asked it first. He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "He was admitted under a name that is not connected to his other work. His records are clean. No one here was at risk. You're certain?" "Yes." She believed him, which perhaps said something about her judgment that she would have to examine later. Okay, she said. She moved to walk past him. He didn't step aside exactly, but he didn't block her either, and there was approximately 6 inches of space between them when she passed, and she was aware of exactly how much of it she was using. Layla, he said. She stopped. He hadn't used her name before. She'd been the nurse, functionally. She turned around. I did look into your situation, he said. I want to be clear about that. I did not ask permission, and I should have. She looked at him. Why are you telling me that now, she said. Because I said you had all the information you needed to make a choice, he said. And you didn't. Not quite. He held her gaze when he said it. He didn't look away or soften it or add anything to cushion it. He simply told her and let it sit there between them, taking up space. She was not a person who was easily rattled, and she was rattled. Thank you for telling me, she said finally. She left. She spent the next week in the ordinary run of her life, which was full enough that there was no room for much else. More doubles, a difficult family meeting for a patient who was not going to get better, a very good shift where everything went right, and she ate dinner with Joelle in the cafeteria at midnight and laughed for the first time in what felt like several months. She deposited the bank draft. She called the collections number and spoke to a human being and told him the debt was being paid in full. The human being sounded oddly, slightly disappointed. She called her brother in Halifax, and they talked for an hour about their father and about nothing, which was the same thing. She did not hear from Soren Vane. She told herself she was not looking for signs that she would. The troubles started on a Tuesday at approximately 7:15 p.m., which Layla would later reflect was a deeply inconvenient time for trouble, being neither late enough to feel dramatic nor early enough to feel manageable. She had been walking to the metro after her shift, earbuds in, listening to a patient's family member who had sent her a recording of her late husband playing piano. He'd been a music teacher too, and she'd mentioned it once, and the family member had thought she'd want to hear it, and she did. It turned out she did want to hear it, when 2 men fell into step beside her, not together, or at least pretending not to be together. She noticed because she had good ears. She also noticed that they were both looking at their phones, which was normal, except that neither of them was actually looking at their phones in a way that suggested anything on those phones was engaging them. She crossed the street. One of them crossed with her. The other continued and crossed half a block down. She had been a night shift nurse in Montréal for 3 years. She had walked home from this hospital in all kinds of weather at all kinds of hours. She knew how to assess whether a situation was something or nothing, and this was not nothing. She did not run, because running communicates information that changes situations. She changed her route. She went into the pharmacy on St. Denis and stood in the bright lights near the pharmacist counter and took out her phone and thought carefully about who she should call and what she should say. She had Joelle's number. She had her brother's number. She had a crisis line she'd memorized years ago because knowing it made her better at her job. And she'd always thought that having information was better than not. She had a business card that had been left under the envelope, that she had taken without deciding whether it was the kind of thing you kept, and had put in the zippered pocket of her bag without looking at it again. She looked at it now. No name on the card, a number. Nothing else. She texted it. I think someone is following me. I'm at the Pharmaprix on St. Denis. The response came in 40 seconds. Don't leave. I'm 12 minutes out. He was there in 9. She knew later that she should have had more questions, more resistance, more of the clear-eyed skepticism that had served her well for most of her adult life. She knew this in the abstract, clinical way that she knew most things about herself. She would have told any patient to trust slowly, to demand answers, to protect herself. She also knew that she had been frightened in that pharmacy, in the specific, precise way that fear worked when it was correct. Not panicked, not irrational, just a cold, clear signal that something was wrong, and that when Soren Vane had come through the door and scanned the room and found her in 3 seconds and come directly to where she was standing, something in her that had been braced for a long time had very quietly unbraced. That was not the same as trusting him. She knew that. It was something else, something smaller. Just the feeling of not being the only one paying attention. She told him what she'd seen. He listened without interrupting, which she was coming to understand was simply how he processed information. When she finished, he asked 2 questions: which direction the second man had gone, and whether either of them had said anything to her. She answered both. "Okay," he said. He was looking at his phone, typing something quickly. "I'll have someone drive you home." "I don't need someone will drive you home," he said, and then looked up, and there was nothing aggressive in it, just certainty. "Please," she looked at him. "Explain to me what's happening," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Tobias Cray has people who don't like him," he said finally. "Some of those people have become aware that he was in the hospital. They are looking for points of pressure." "Points of pressure," she repeated. "People who had close contact with him, who might know something. I don't know anything. They don't know that." She processed this. She processed it the way she processed difficult clinical information, methodically, without letting the emotional weight of it collapse the logical structure. "Who are they?" she said. "People it is better not to know about in detail. Are they going to come back? Not if I handle it." She looked at him steadily. "What does handling it look like?" He met her gaze. "It looks like them understanding that you have no information and are not a useful pressure point. That's all. And are you going to tell me how that happens?" "No," he said, "but I'll tell you when it's done." It was, she thought, the most honest conversation she'd ever had with someone who was telling her very little. She let them drive her home. She did not see Soren Vane for 11 days. She knew he was there, or that someone was, because twice she noticed the black vehicle idling across from her building, and once she saw, at the far end of her street, a figure in a dark coat that stood for approximately 20 minutes without apparent purpose before disappearing. She did not know whether to find this alarming or reassuring, and she eventually settled on both, which felt like the only honest position. On the 11th day, he texted, "It's been handled. You won't be bothered again." She stared at the message for a long moment. "How?" she typed back. The response took a few minutes. They understood the situation. She thought about asking what that meant. She decided she already knew what it meant, at least in outline, and that the outline was enough for her. "Thank you," she wrote. A pause. "I'm sorry you were involved in this," he replied. "That was because of me. I moved Tobias into that unit without considering who would be around him." She sat in her apartment reading that message and thinking about what it meant that he was apologizing. In her experience, people with that kind of, she still didn't have the right word for it. Weight, maybe, authority, rarely apologized. Not because they were remorseless, but because they operated in a world where accountability and apology had been separated for so long that the gap had grown too wide to cross casually. He had crossed it. Twice now. "You didn't know what would happen," she wrote. "I should have accounted for the possibility," he replied. "I didn't, that's on me." She looked out her window. The street was empty. The January dark had arrived early, the way it always did, pressing in against the glass, and her apartment was warm and quiet, and she thought about her father playing piano in the church basement, where he'd given lessons for 25 years, and about the recording on her phone, and about the very strange arc of the last 3 weeks. "Are you going to tell me who you are?" she typed. "Actually." A long pause this time. "I think you've already worked out most of it," he wrote. She had. She'd worked it out somewhere around day 6, when she'd found the second court document mention, and the pattern in the city business registry, and the name T. Cray, in a very brief and very old news story about certain organizational changes in a particular kind of operation, the kind that Montréal had always had and always would, the kind that existed in the deliberate blind spots of a city that had always preferred elegant ambiguity to clarity. "Does it change things?" he wrote. "For you." She thought about the pharmacy, about the envelope, about the 9 minutes. "I don't know yet," she wrote honestly. "That's fair," he replied. She put her phone down and stood at the window for a while, watching the ordinary dark of the street, the snow that was coming again, the particular blue-gray of a Montreal winter night that she had known her whole life, and would probably know for the rest of it. Her phone buzzed once more. "If you'd like to have dinner," he wrote, "I know a place on Laurier. They know me there. You'd be safe." She looked at the message. She thought about Joelle saying most men who want something make sure you don't have the option of leaving it behind. She thought about the envelope still on the table, waiting. She thought about 9 minutes. "Thursday," she wrote. "Thursday," he agreed. She set her phone down and went to make tea, and outside her window the snow fell on Montréal the way it always had, steady and indifferent, and without any particular concern for the people below. And she felt, for the first time in a long time, something that was not quite hope and not quite peace, but was perhaps the feeling that comes right before both of those things. The moment when the weight you've been carrying shifts just slightly, and you realize for the first time that you had been carrying it alone.